What I've made here is a worksheet to get rid of all the confusing elements and just focus on exactly what's going on with these tools. Over here we have, think of it as maybe a little bit of an illustration. So we have a shadow on the bottom and a bit of smooth rendering. This is just our sample sheet. And in many cases, this is what I start with. I've done the underpainting, I've established the color, light, and shadow, and now I'm just going to be adding details on top. So if I were to take this camo here and put it on top, if I change the blending mode away from the default of normal, I've got a couple different effects. So if I do multiply, it's going to darken everything. So we can see all the values underneath it get darker. If I were to do screen, all the values would get lighter. Overlay is in a third category, which is something of a middle ground. Here we have any values that are lighter in the source material, make the underlying layers lighter. Anything that's darker than 50% gets darker. Now, what if I want more camo? Well, I would just make more copies, right? So I'm using the arrow tool, I hold down Alt, and I drag out a copy. This is a problem that I see all the time in beginners' work when they're using overlays, is they have this overlapping effect. The more you do it, the more of a problem you get. Maybe what you were looking for was this original camo look. You had a kind of a nice amount of contrast. It was looking good. You just needed more of it. We don't want this almost ever. I can't think of a scenario where you'd want them to overlap in this way. Okay, so what are our choices? First, I'm going to select both these layers and turn them back to the normal blending mode. So this is them with no fancy blending attached. If I take these two layers and flatten them together, and then switch the new flattened combination to an overlay blending mode, that's actually the look I'm going for. So essentially what I want is one layer with all of the texture to receive this blending mode. The real problem comes in when we have blending mode on top of blending mode and all of them kind of mix and blend together. Well, then you're thinking, okay, so I know that if I flatten something, then I lose my options. And you're right. What we need is a solution that allows kind of the best of both worlds. And that's where groups and layer masks are going to make blending mode so much more powerful. So let me take a step back here. I'm going to delete both of these, roll back to the beginning, and you may have noticed that my little rendering swatch here is in a group, which I've called main group, and it has a layer mask on top. So if I were to make a copy of this camo here and put it inside of my main group, now it's masked, just like you'd expect. So then how do we get to that idea of having more camo without having that overlap? Well, we'll start by getting back to that idea of if I made all the camo I wanted and then flattened those all together, so now I have kind of one big layer of camo, that would work fine as an overlay. That gives me the result I'm looking for. Instead of flattening, what I can also do is select all these layers, hit make new group from layers, just the little folder button here. And this is important, I'm going to name it right here. Get in the habit of doing this. I'll call this camo. What I have now is the main group, which I can collapse. And within that, I have the rendering at the bottom, and then the camo subgroup. This is just like folders in your operating system. What I can do is I can turn the blending mode of the camo folder to overlay. And this gives us the result we're looking for. It's just like flattening those 5 camo layers together and then making the result overlay blending mode. It has that exact same look, except we didn't need to flatten them. They're all still here. So I can take any of them and shift them around. I can free transform any of them, make them bigger or smaller. And Photoshop is applying essentially an order of operations. It's saying, as a group, I am overlay blending mode. What it does is it takes all the contents of that group, all these 5 different layers, and kind of considers them one layer, if you want to think of it that way. And then it takes that one layer, or the end result of everything in the folder, and it makes that the overlay blending mode. And this is really nice for a variety of reasons. The first I'm going to talk about is just, it is a single item on the layer list, so I can lower the opacity just all at once. And it's as if I was working with a single element, even though I know the camo is actually made up of these individual pieces. So I've retained flexibility. Okay, I'm going to leave that camo group for a minute. Now what I want to do is to work with that second type we talked about, which is opaque details. So here I've cut out a few bolts, as you saw in the last example, and these are just from photos. And I want to have these on top of this metal surface. Well, I am going to begin just by making some copies. So maybe I'll copy a couple of these big ones. Then some of these smaller ones, I'm holding Alt to duplicate out copies. And then if I'm envisioning this kind of curving around, I actually want another row that's flipped vertically and a little bit narrower. Okay, and I'll make some copies of this as well. Now, even though these are not going to be using any sort of overlay or multiply blending modes, I'm going to want to handle these in the same way I did with subgroups. It's just going to give me so much more power, as you'll see in a minute. So let me select one of these layers by holding down Control, and then Control Shift to add to that selection. So here I have all of these second row of bolts selected. Make a group from selected. I'll call this bolts mid. And I'm going to drag it inside my main group. I want it to be on top of the camo. And then I'll just do the same with the others. So these are bolts bottom, bolts top. And now I have items that are, easy to modify as a group. Also, they keep my layer stack less cluttered. This is good. But it's not just because I want to be really organized. In fact, with my personality, I am far from organized. So to do this, there's got to be some real utility here. And the utility is adjustment layers. Let's say what I want to do is to make all these bottom bolts darker and all these top ones lighter, as if there's some sort of light coming down from above and there's a bit of a shadow down here. And I also want to do it in a non-destructive way. The way I would do that would be an adjustment layer. So if I just wanted to do this bolt right here, I would make an adjustment layer. I like curves, so I'm going to be using a lot of curves. And then right now, if I were to modify it, it just modifies everything below it on the layer stack. So camo, everything. If I hold down Alt and click right between those two layers, it creates what's called a clipping mask. Or in this case, I'm just clipping an adjustment layer to one layer. This means that any changes I make on my adjustment layer here only apply to this bolt. But wouldn't it be better if I could do the same change to all of these bolts? In fact, I can. So I'm going to just make this a really easy to see adjustment layer. I'm actually going to tweak it later, but it is very visible right now. I'm going to decouple it from this. So now it's affecting everything below it in the layer stack. And if I move it directly above the group that they're in, so bolts mid, I can clip it to the entire contents of that group. This is amazing. You'll also notice from here on out, I'm not going to go over to the layers palette and hold down Alt and click. I just do enough clipping masks that I have a keyboard shortcut set up for it, and I encourage you to do the same. Now what this means is each of these layers is still an independent layer. You can see I can move them around, whatever I want to do. But this single curves adjustment is going to modify all of them. And it's also going to do it in an interactive way that I can tweak and not flatten those changes and then just go on about my work. So let's apply that same idea to the bottom row next. I want these to be darker. So I'll say bolts bottom, make a curves layer here. Just going to drop down the value and clip it. Okay, so you can see there's before, there's after. And I can just fiddle with it as much as I want, and it's not a permanent change. And then for the top ones, bolts top, I'm going to do the same thing. Here I'm going to brighten these up a bit. That looks okay. Now, what is one thing that all of these bolts need? Well, I think the color doesn't quite match the scene. Right now they're very neutral, and yet I have this kind of blue material. So what if I wanted to apply a color cast to all of the bolts, but I also wanted to keep it in this kind of non-destructive method? This is where things get really fun. So I'm going to select all of these 3 groups and 3 clipping masks and make group from layers. And I'm going to call this bolts. So if we expand bolts, we see there is bolts top, bolts mid, bolts bottom. are all grouped into something just called bolts. Well, I can use the exact same principle here. So now I take curves and I clip it just to bolts. And so this is any change that I do here will apply to all of the bolts groups, because it just goes down the entire chain of subgroups and applies that clipping mask. Now, I don't actually want to change the values. I already did that with the previous one. So the lighting is fine. I just want to change color. So I'm going to add a little blue and a little green. There we go. I feel like that matches the color palette better. So there's before and there's after. This is so powerful. What I have are 4 curves clipping masks. The 3 are just changing the values of the bottom ones, values of mid, and values of top. And then independent of that, I'm changing the color. All of those are non-destructive. And each layer is still independent. You know, you can scale or do whatever you want to the layer. There's no position that's important. Okay, so you can see now why these groups are labeled, because as you get more and more groups, things start to get a little complicated. So we've talked about general overlays with the camo. We've talked about opaque details here with these bolts. Now let's get some stenciling happening. And this is not an official term. If you Google stencil in Photoshop, you probably won't get what I'm describing. The actual term is blend if. This is another weird one that a lot of people stay away from, but man, is it powerful. So I have it over top. I'm actually going to put it inside of my main group here. So if I make it bigger, it's going to stay inside that mask. What I want, though, are just these bolts. I want the panel borders, and I don't really want any of the contents in the middle here. I just want to have it look like this surface here has seams on it. Well, the way I do that is in Effects, Blending Options. And then inside of Blending Options, there's this bottom middle category here called Blend If. And I'm just going to stick in gray for now. That's the value or the luminosity of the layer. And I'm going to just focus on this layer. So essentially this currently is saying display the entire value scale. If I were to move one of these arrows, it's going to display only part of the value scale. So let's say I only want the darks. So I'm going to clamp the white values down. And you can see as I move this, anything that's high value starts to disappear. It does have a bit of a ragged edge, and because of that ragged edge, it doesn't look quite so nice. So I am going to use Alt or Option on a Mac and snap this arrow in half. And this just kind of softens that threshold. You can make it really wide if you want, and it'll have a very slow fall off. But with this, I'm able to interactively hide parts of the layer. Now this is still on the normal blending mode. I could change it to multiply or to screen or something like that, soft light. But I think what I really want is the pixels as they were in the original photo, fully opaque, but just part of them, just the dark ones and none of the rest. And maybe this looks better in my layer stack if it's below the bolts, so I can just drag it down there, above camo, below bolts. And maybe I now need to shift some of these around, but that's fine because, you know, they are non-destructively changed in their color. So I don't have to worry about it. And maybe it feels like the texture layer is a little bit too prominent, so I can lower the overall opacity. But at any time I can change how much of that layer is made visible just by double clicking on these little 2 overlapping squares, which pulls up my layer style. And I just change the blend if parameters. So if that was just this layer, as in I'm looking at the photo and I'm thinking I only want these seams, there's another thing you can do, which is to say, what about the underlying layer? So I'm actually going to turn this layer back up to normal and hide it a minute. Now let's just say for some weird reason what you wanted was you only wanted it to display over top of like this middle camo color and you wanted nothing elsewhere. Well, I can use the same property to affect that. So I'll go to Blending Options. And this time I'm going to leave this layer alone, but say Underlying Layer. And here I can move these arrows to change where the entire pixels are being displayed. So if I can soften either of those fall offs by breaking the arrow in half with Alt, you can get some really interesting results without any manual masking. So you see I can move this layer around and it's almost like it has a layer mask on it. Some parts are hidden, some parts are revealed. Yet, I didn't do any masking. And if the values underneath were to change, like if I were to hide that camo, the results would change. So it's really just looking for values that are either lighter or darker, lower in the layer stack, and it's using that as a mask. Now, this example is kind of an odd one because I don't know why you would ever have things masked by camo like this, so we're actually going to take that off. But I hope you can see that these two sliders here in the blend if category are extremely useful. The ones I find myself using the most are actually the ones for this layer, because I usually have a bit of photo texture and I only want part of it. And so I'll use these arrows to kind of knock out the parts I don't want. Now, one thing to note is that you can apply a clipping mask to it, but if you do, those two components are going to fight a little bit. So let's say I want to make it a bit redder, and I also want to change the values. As I change the values, it's sort of conflicting with that initial rule I set up, because I said only display the pixels that are dark. And so previously it was, just these little seam borders. But then as I lower the overall darkness of that whole layer, more and more gets displayed just because more of the pixels are darker. So if you want to change it with a clipping mask, you might then have to also go back into your blending options and kind of lower where that threshold was. Now, as a final option, you can actually just rasterize the changes. So let's say this was the look you're going for, and there's no reason you'd ever want to reveal more of that original photo. What I can do is just make a blank layer above it, select both layers, and merge down. And now I have a normal opaque layer with some gaps in it, and all of that blending mode or blending options here don't apply anymore. They've been baked down into the layer, and the layer is just a normal layer at this point. And this is something I do a lot when I've been using blending options, because now that it's a layer that I can paint on, it becomes more predictable. So I can clip a curves adjustment to it, and I can control it, and I can do whatever I want, because it's, at this point, essentially like a masked layer. Very easy to work with. But as you can see, I had a lot of control. And that's really where this stuff, I think, falls apart for beginners, is these tools are available to them. They seem a little bit confusing, and so they don't take full advantage. But once you understand how to control them, adjustment layers become just extremely powerful. Add a group into the mix, and adjustment layers become even better, because you can take similar elements like these bolts here and apply a single adjustment layer to an entire group of similar elements. I do this so often in paintings, it is extremely useful. So in the next video, we're going to take a look at these same tools, but in a slightly more realistic scenario. Let's take a look.